We're joined now by a member of the Senate Armed Services and Banking Committee. Mike Rounds is with us. Senator, thank you for joining us. This deal has been long in the making, of course. I'd like to get your thoughts on it, as China says it violates the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty because it transfers nuclear technology to a non-nuclear state. Are they right?
Look, Australia is one of the Five Eyes. They are one of our closest partners. I'm not exactly sure what China is suggesting in this particular case, but I can tell you we look forward to having a continued, very close relationship with Australia. And if Australia wants to participate in our nuclear submarine programs, I am totally in favor.
Senator, we also want to ask you about the story of day, which is, of course, SVB and the financial chaos that this has ensued. Sir, obviously we're hearing from a number of lawmakers on the left, Democrats, who are talking about the fact, and the president himself, that Congress needs to do more. There needs to be more regulation. Do you foresee any sort of regulation, scrutiny coming from Congress in this session?
I think the first thing we do is to get the facts, and we find out whether or not the regulators that had the authority and the capabilities to actually review these transactions that have occurred and the balance sheets, along with the liquidity statements that are already required. Let's find out whether or not they did their job. I understand that the Federal Reserve is looking at it. I think Vice Chair Barr is going to head up that committee. They'll take a look at whether or not their review of this particular institution was done correctly. Then we'll be able to find out whether or not they had access to all the data that they wanted. You know, in this particular case, we're talking about a liquidity problem, not necessarily a capital problem. The vast majority of all of the different bank institutions, they have good capital requirements in place right now. They are well capitalized across the industry. In this particular case, you had a unique type of an institution that catered to a particular niche section of the market. It's a very large part of the market, and it had about half of all of the venture capitalists that were directly involved with technology and also with healthcare that are within the United States. So they had a real unique niche location in the industries that are important, small business development and so forth. But what we want to know is, what was the logic behind them taking a lot of their capital and putting it into long-term treasuries, 10-year treasuries, that if they needed the liquidity, they would take a real haircut in taking out that in a short-term basis. So let's find out whether or not the Fed was aware of it, whether or not the regulators had looked at that and just simply didn't think that inflation was going to be a problem, or if there was something, you know, that needs to be done. But in terms of the liquidity, they get a form every quarter, every single quarter. It's called I believe it's called a 2052A form that they have to report back into the Fed to share what their liquidity plan is.
Well, Senator, the president wants to talk about regulations, he said this morning, and I suspect that means your committee. What's your reaction to the administration coming up to Capitol Hill asking to tighten or retighten, in some cases, financial regs?
Once again, it's better if we get good data first. Let's not do a knee-jerk reaction. Let's find out what it is that it's going to take. Data first, then we can decide whether or not we need to modify anything there, and whether or not the regulators actually utilized the data that is being provided right now. I think that's a really important part of this discussion that we're going to have. The other thing that I think when we talk about this type of a discussion, more regs and so forth, there is a cost every time you put a new regulation in effect, and we're going to have to determine whether or not new regulations would actually be needed or not. I personally would want to get a lot of the facts first and then make a decision. And the other piece of this is let's make sure that the regulators use the tools that were available to them, because they have the ability to tailor the regulatory aspects on a bank-by-bank basis when needed. And then let's find out whether or not there was actually a good set of reports coming in that were actually by the regulators before we start talking about adding on additional regulation.
Senator, it sounds like you want more data, so it sounds like potentially we could see hearings from Congress before we see any sort of legislation. Thank you so much for joining us, Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota. Coming up.